J'ouvre maintenant la séance. Bienvenue à vous toutes.
Welcome. I now call the meeting to order. Welcome to the 17th meeting of the Standing Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the subcommittee on Monday, 26th of January 2026, the subcommittee will meet as part of its study on the current situation of human rights and democracy defenders worldwide. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the standing orders. Members may attend in person or via the Zoom app.
For the benefit of the witnesses and members, please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. J'aimerais maintenant souhaiter la bienvenue.
I would now like to welcome our first witness.
Mr. Mohsen Hassan, head of the board Nazra for Feminist Study. He is with us by video conference. Mr. Omaid Sharif, president of Art Lords, also by video conference. From Equitas International Center for Human Rights Education, we have Madame Odette McCarthy, Executive Director, and Mr. Gerardo Dicas, Senior Manager, Impact and Accountability. From Resilient Societies, we have Abdoulaye Ba, Fellow. We have Ghazal Habib Yar from a Human Rights Advocate. From United Nations Watch, we have Hilal Neuer, Executive Director, also by video conference. Welcome to you all. And I would like to give every one of you 5 minutes for introduction. And I appeal on you to respect the time, please. And I would like to start by inviting Mr. Mohsen Hassan to take the floor for 5 minutes. The floor is yours, Mr. Hassan.
Thank you so much,
Madam Mohsen Hassan.
Don't worry. Thank you so much. Chair, honorable members, thank you for this invitation. I speak to you today as the chair of the board of Nazra for Feminist Studies and as a part of a growing global ecosystem of movements, including Demos Kratos. This network connects grassroots actors, thinkers, and institutions working to reimagine democracy from the ground up. From this dual position, local and global, I want to focus on one central message. Democracy cannot be strengthened without investing in the lived realities, narratives, and leadership of women and human rights defenders, especially in regions like the Middle East and North Africa. Too often, women and human rights defenders are engaged only at the moment of crisis, when they are imprisoned, attacked, or exiled. But democracy is not built in moments of crisis alone. It's built through narratives, daily resilience, and lived experiences. Women human rights defenders and minority leaders in the MENA region are mediating local conflicts, supporting displaced communities, leading economic survival initiatives, and creating informal peace structures where formal ones usually fail. Yet, Their voices remain underrepresented and in global policy and decision-making spaces. Supporting them is not only about protection, it's about enabling them to shape the global understanding of democracy itself. This is where global networks like Demoskratis play a critical role. These networks provide protection through visibility and collective advocacy, constructive solidarity, not symbolic, but strategic and sustained, platforms that connect local realities to the global policy making, spaces for peace building, including tracks for engagements that are often overlooked. In regions affected by war and fragmentation, such networks are not optional. They are infrastructure for survival and transformations. In the MENA region, where conflict and instability are widespread, investing in women and minorities is not a social policy choice. It is a strategy, it's a security strategy. From my experience, including founding one of the first feminist funds in the region, I have seen that when women and marginalized groups are resourced, they invest in civic engagement and accountability, local peace building and mediations, economic resiliences through entrepreneurships and social innovation, and community-based safety and protection systems. This is what I call holistic empowerment, economic empowerment, political participation, social protection, security and safety policies. And importantly, it requires engagements from governments, private sector actors, civil society. Peace is not negotiated only at the high-level tables. It's built in communities. Formal peace processes often exclude the most affected people. Global and regional networks sustain tracks for peace efforts, create safe spaces for dialogue across divides, and ensure that women and minority voices are not erased. If we don't invest in these networks, we risk building peace processes that are detached, fragile, and unsustainable. Canada role. From commitment to leadership, Canada has a strong legacy in supporting human rights and feminist approaches. I particularly welcome the appointment of a new Women, Peace and Security Ambassador. This is an important step, but this is also a moment to move further. Canada can play a transformative role by, one, investing in global networks, support networks like Demoskratis that connect local actors to the global system, enabling protection, advocacy, and influence. Two, supporting flexible movement-led funding. Ensure funding reaches grassroots and feminist organizations directly, especially those led by women and minorities. Three, elevating narratives. Use diplomatic platforms to amplify the lived realities of women and human rights defenders, not just statistics, but voices. Bridge local to global decision-making. Facilitate pathways for defenders to engage in international negotiations, policy spaces, and peace processes, because resources are not only financial, they are also access, legitimacy, and visibility. In regions like the Middle East and North Africa, where war and instability are shaping everyday life, peace will not come only from agreements between states. It will come from people, communities, and networks that continue to hold societies together. If we want to have a sustainable democracy, we must invest in those who are already participating in it under the most difficult conditions. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Time well respected. Thank you, Madam Mozan. And now I would like to invite Mr. Umaid Sharifi to take the floor for 5 minutes. Please go.
Honorable Chair and distinguished members of the subcommittee, friends and colleagues, thank you for this opportunity. On August 15, 2021, my team and I were painting a mural on the walls of Kabul's governor's office when the Taliban entered the capital. Some of those colleagues, after years of waiting, have finally found refuge here in Canada, which I'm very grateful for. In the 3 weeks that followed, before the Taliban had even announced a government, they painted over more than 2,000 murals that art lords had created across Afghanistan over the previous 7 years. 7 years of work erased in 3 weeks. It was deliberate. They were dragging Afghanistan and 20 years of democracy and development back into the dark. I am an Artivist, president of Artlords, a movement that began on the walls of Kabul and has since worked with communities in more than 20 countries to reclaim public space, defend dignity, and amplify voices through art. I also speak to you as someone who has witnessed firsthand what happens when democracy collapses. The Taliban did not only dismantle institutions, they erased voices. Artists, journalists, and civil society leaders were silenced, displaced, or forced into hiding. This is not an Afghan story. It is part of a global pattern. Authoritarian regimes are no longer operating in isolation. They share surveillance tools, coordinate across borders to silence dissidents in exile, and learn from another faster than democracies do. Meanwhile, those defending democracy remain fragmented, underfunded, and at risk. The world order itself is shifting. The assumptions that once anchored global stability are no longer certain, and middle powers like Canada are being asked to lead in new ways. This moment requires more than reaffirming values. It requires rethinking how we support those on the front lines. From our experience, I would offer 3 reflections. First, human rights defenders are not beneficiaries. They're partners. What we too often see instead is short-term project funding that prioritizes compliance over impact and creates distance between those designing solution and those living the reality. The most effective responses we have often witnessed are locally led, trust-based, and flexible. They invest in people, not just projects. Second, protection must go beyond emergency response. For many artists and activists, the threat is not a single moment of crisis. It's constant. The colleagues who eventually reached Canada needed far more than a flight. They needed a legal status, time to rebuild, mental health support after years of trauma, and the means to keep working. For an artivist, the silence after evacuation can become its own form of erasure. Too often, the airport. If we protect individuals but fail to sustain their ecosystems, we lose the very movements we aim to support. Third, culture and storytelling are not secondary. They're central to democratic resilience. Authoritarian systems understand the power of narrative. That's why they target artists first. Through our work, we have seen how art creates space where dialogue becomes possible, where dignity is restored, and where communities begin to imagine alternatives again. If democracy is to be defended, it must be felt, seen, and experienced, not only legislated. In this context, Canada has a unique opportunity. Canada's strength lies in its credibility, its diversity, and its ability to bridge global North and global South. As highlighted in the brief submitted to this subcommittee, Canada can lead not only by imposing models, but by convening, connecting, and enabling partnerships rooted in mutual respect and shared learning. I would encourage 3 areas of action. 1, expand long-term flexible funding mechanisms, modeled on instruments like the Equality Fund, Lifeline, that reaches grassroots actors directly with timelines measured in years, not just months. 2, build a Canadian rapid response capacity for human rights defenders under threat, combining risk analysis, legal pathways, digital security, and trusted partners on the ground, deployable in days, not months. 3, create standing spaces where artists, activists, and policymakers collaborate as equals, bringing frontline defenders into the design of the policies meant to protect them, not only into their delivery. Because ultimately, democracy is not only defended in parliaments, it is defended in the classrooms, in communities, and on the walls of cities where people still choose to speak, even when it's dangerous. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sharifi. And now I would like to invite Madame Odette McCurdy to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président et honorables
Thank you,
membres.
Chair.
As a conduit and as a witness of what defenders tell us in their own words and in data. We thank you for the opportunity at a moment when the questions you're studying carry real stakes. Democracy worldwide is under growing pressure. No country can take its resilience for granted, according to the 2026 VDEM Democracy Report. And recently, our Prime Minister Carney acknowledged what communities have long known. Human rights commitments are not applied consistently. Enforcement is selective, accountability is uneven. And that raises a question. Why continue to champion human rights in such a weakened system? Abandoning the framework would mean losing the only universally agreed set of principles that build stronger, more cohesive communities and countries. And in moments of fragility, the task is not to discard the system, but to strengthen and reform it, keeping what remains essential to its purpose. And it's in this context, building informed, connected, and rights-aware citizens, as our two peers have spoken to today, democratic resilience depends not only on institutions, but on the people who claim their rights. For nearly 60 years, Equitas has worked in Canada and globally to strengthen leaders and organizations. In the past 14 months, Equitas trained over 150 human rights defenders from 40 different countries, and nearly 1 in 3 face threats, surveillance, physical violence, or the targeting of their families, and not a single one of them stopped working. But when those defenders needed protection, 60% of them turned to a trusted peer. 27% reported to police, and nearly half never used a formal channel at all. We're often asked, well, then what is the connection between democracy and human rights? For many communities, both concepts feel abstract and distant from local realities. At their very core, human rights are the values and principles that protect human dignity, and democracy is the system that gives those values effect in public life through participation, accountability, and the power to shape the rules that govern. A healthy democracy requires meaningful, safe, and equal participation. When whites are weakened, democracy weakens. When marginalized communities are excluded, system fails. Canada has, at very key moments, demonstrated bold international leadership, from its contribution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with Canadian John Humphrey as a co-author, to advancing the global landmines ban in the 90s and support efforts to end apartheid in the 80s. Looking back at these efforts reflect a consistent pattern. When Canada leads, it helps shape global norms around dignity, equality, justice, and accountability. What if Canada acts now so that in 10 years from today, it's recognized not only for its principles, but for how it supported and connected human rights and democracy defenders? Géraldou?
Notre recommandation, ancrée dans la pratique des données.
Our 3 recommendations, anchored in practice, evidence, and the testimony of thousands of human rights and democracy defenders, are a pathway to reposition human rights and democracy support as a strategic priority across Canada foreign policy. First of all, reinforce support to defenders of human rights and democracy on a worldwide scale. Defenders of human rights do not move backwards, they adapt. Our data show that those facing threats and harassment or intimidate or bullying do not stop working. To the contrary, they deepen their community engagement, multiply initiatives, develop partnerships, and reach more people. The risk often becomes a catalyst rather than a break. We recommend to support sustainably their work by funding peer networks, psychosocial support, and rapid response mechanisms. These informal responses are often the first line of protection. Secondly, support is essential for which is the education in human rights. Canada can embody a constructive model by supporting people and organizations that defend human rights through human rights education now, and even more if it will join the Human Rights Council in 2027. This support allows people to understand and defend their rights, including the democratic right to be heard, to participate in governments, and to access information. The skills to recognize and challenge systems of oppression, discrimination, and abuse of power, the connections and solidarity networks to act collectively and protect one another, the grounding in national and international human rights norms to hold decision makers constructively to account. Third, gender equality as a pillar of Canada's credibility. Gender equality is not an abstract principle. It constitutes the foundation of inclusive and stable societies. As such, it must continue to be a part of Canada's foreign policy. Gender equality is also a lever for furthering democracy. Canada can play a role of leadership by supporting spaces which gather defenders of human rights and of democracy from various places, by fostering multi-year funding and by recognizing organizations and networks that they built as being a strategic civic infrastructure. These networks reduce isolation, amplify impact.
No, I believe you are going to share the time with your, okay. So you take the floor for 2 minutes and a half, please.
Honorable Chair, distinguished members, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Ghazal Habibyar, and I'm originally from Afghanistan. I have worked on governance, development, and women's rights issues. Today, I represent Resilient Society as a Canadian-based organization that supports human rights defenders in Canada and abroad. I also speak from personal experiences. I was a young girl during the first regime of Taliban in '96, when education was banned and we were denied basic freedoms. Despite those barriers, I also served as one of the 4 women in the Afghan cabinet as acting Minister of Mines and Petroleum. Today, I live in exile due to my work in government and advocacy for women's rights and democracy. I'll focus my remarks today specifically on challenges facing women human rights defenders. In Afghanistan today, Afghan women and women human rights defenders face what can only be described as gender apartheid. Their challenges are real. First, the acute personal risk. Women defenders face arrest, intimidation, disappearances, and targeted harassments with no protection or access to justice. Second, dismantling of civic spaces. Women are excluded from public life, girls are denied education, cutting off both current participation and future leadership. Third, as civic spaces close, recording abuse and violence becomes very dangerous, yet very critical. Canada's support for Afghan women's case under CEDAW has been crucial. We hope to see it sustained and extended to similar contexts. Across Afghanistan, Sudan, Myanmar, Iran, Syria, and many other countries, we see a clear pattern. Repressive systems are not only targeting political opposition, they are systematically targeting women who lead resistance. This reflects broader global rollback of rights, where repression is increasingly normalized and transnational, unfortunately. Last week, Ottawa hosted nearly 400 leaders at inaugural Ottawa Civic Space Summit, highlighting that protecting civic space and amplifying frontline voices is key to resilience in Canada and globally. Canada can lead by strengthening support, especially for women human rights defenders, through protection, documentation, pathways of continued civic engagement. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Merci, chers collègues. Mesdames et
Thank
messieurs.
you. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. the Chair, members of the subcommittee, my colleague talked about the defenders of human rights, and I want to emphasize those who have experienced the situation of asylum seeker. I'm Abdoulaye Abba. I'm addressing you as someone who's directly affected by the situation that you're studying. I'm a human rights defender from Mali who came to Canada in August 2023 after being forced into exile. For more than 10 years, I dedicated my life to defending human rights in my country of origin. With a master's degree in legal and political sciences, I worked to promote the rights of women and adolescent girls, to facilitate access to justice for the most vulnerable, and to support marginalized communities such as the LGBTQ people. And there's a slavery through descendants in Mali, in the eastern part of Mali. It was a deep commitment rooted in the conviction that human dignity must be protected everywhere and for everyone. But this commitment came at a cost. My activities exposed me to serious threats, forcing me into exile in Canada. I had to leave behind my work, my friends, my family, my roots, and a part of myself. When I arrived in Canada, I found a country that protects human rights and an environment where free speech can exist. For that, I'm grateful. But exile also brings its own set of challenges, like for many defenders in exile. So I had to deal with my professional experience not being recognized. I had to rebuild a professional social and community network. I had to overcome isolation and its psychological impacts. And I had to find ways to stay connected to the realities of my country of origin. And yet, despite these challenges, we carry on. Today, I continue to work with organizations in Canada to collaborate with local organizations participating in advocacy initiatives and contributing to the integration of vulnerable populations. My involvement in training programs shows the key role that support mechanisms can play in sustaining the commitment of defenders in exile. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the subcommittee, this has allowed me to realize one essential thing. With a minimum of support, defenders living in exile can once again become powerful agents of change here in Canada. If I have one recommendation to make, it is the following. Canada must invest in a structured and sustainable manner in human rights defenders in exile by actively supporting initiatives that build bridges between their expertise and the democracy and the human rights sectors in Canada, as the Resilient Societies organization does. In practical terms, this involves funding programs that value their lived experience and facilitating their professional integration, particularly through the recognition of foreign qualifications, and creating pathways to sectors related to human rights, advocacy, and public policy. Without this, Canada is depriving itself of unique expertise that was built in contexts where rights are genuinely at risk. So you're 2 minutes over if you can finish. So in conclusion, investing in defenders in exile is investing in the resilience of democracy itself. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mr. Hillel Neuer to speak for 5 minutes, please. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for inviting me to testify on the current situation of democracy and human rights defenders around the world. My organization, UN Watch, leads a coalition of 25 human rights NGOs that for the past 18 years organizes the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights and Democracy. I'm grateful to the Mission of Canada in Geneva for co-hosting the UN opening of our most recent summit. Now, when the UN Human Rights Council recently met in Geneva, members included Qatar, Cuba, Egypt, Pakistan, Vietnam, and Iraq. Regimes that jail journalists, torture dissidents, erase minorities, they were about to sit as judges of the world on human rights. But we were there first with the Geneva Summit to give the microphone not to regimes, but to those they persecute, frontline defenders of the democratic values that Canada seeks to uphold. Permit me to share what we've heard from these courageous dissidents and the common themes that emerged. First, transnational repression. Authoritarian regimes target dissidents abroad. We heard from Chloe Chung. Born and raised in Hong Kong, she joined the pro-democracy movement at age 14 during the 2019 protests, witnessing firsthand the police violence, mass arrests, and dismantling of civil liberties that reshaped her generation. After the imposition of the national security law, she went into exile in 2020 to continue her advocacy abroad. In London, she leads global campaigns calling for the release of political prisoners. In December 2024, the Hong Kong authorities placed a bounty on her head to the amount of 1 million Hong Kong dollars, making her 1 million Hong Kong dollars, making her one of the youngest activists ever targeted. She was only 19, but they put her face on a wanted poster, stuck it all over train stations, the airport, police stations, and declared her a fugitive. Since then, she's been followed, harassed, and threatened in the UK. Quote, many friends have cut me off out of fear of retaliation, she testified. Now, we also heard from Masih Alinejad. She's the journalist whose activism for women's rights in Iran gathered millions of followers and inspired that country's women, life, freedom movement. She lives now in exile in New York. The regime of Iran is trying to kill her. Multiple times they sent hit teams to try and assassinate her. Yet Masih perseveres to speak for the people of Iran, tens of thousands of whom were just massacred in January in 2 days alone for protesting. Now, the second theme is political prisoners. One of these individuals is Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian opposition leader, journalist, and filmmaker. Because he spoke out against Vladimir Putin, they tried to kill him by poisoning him in 2015, again in 2017. He barely survived. He went back to Russia. He spoke out against the regime. In April 2022, after he called Putin a war criminal, they took him away, sentenced him to 25 years in prison for treason. He was languishing in a Siberian gulag in solitary confinement. His wife, Evgenia, went around the world tirelessly fighting for his release. By a miracle, in August 2024, Vladimir was released as part of a prisoner exchange. Now, we invited him recently to speak at the UN. His appeal is that Canada and other democracies can still save thousands of Ukrainian civilian hostages held in Russian custody, to help children abducted by Russia, Russian political prisoners jailed because of their opposition to the war. All of these people, their release must be an essential part of any ceasefire agreement. Third, assault on religious freedom. China is a member of the Human Rights Council, yet they crush any independent religious leader who does not answer to the regime, like Pastor Ezra Jin, founder of one of China's largest underground churches. They took him away in October with 27 other leaders of the Zion Church. We heard from his daughter, Grace Jin Drexel. Her appeal is for Canada and other democracies to call on the Chinese regime to release all Zion Church leaders immediately. Quote, do not accept China's trampling of human rights and universal freedom with silence. If left unchecked, Beijing's wave of repression will reverberate around the world, she said, for freedom of religion and human rights as a whole. Fourth, Mr. Chair, assault on women's rights. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, as we heard, continue to erase the faces and the voices of women. At our summit, we heard from Marzia Hamidi. She's an Afghan Taekwondo athlete who fled Kabul after the Taliban takeover. She now trains in France. Because of death threats, she has to live 24/7 under police protection due to these threats against her life. Through sports and advocacy, she stands for every girl told that she must disappear. Fifth and finally, Mr. Chair, we are seeing an assault on journalists and freedom of the press. In Zimbabwe, the journalist Blessed Malanga reported on corruption, and for the crime of covering a press conference critical of the president, he was charged with incitement to violence, detained for 73 days. Now, after just speaking now at our Geneva summit, Mr. Blessed Malanga was threatened with rearrest and unable to return to his family in Zimbabwe. We urge Canada to be vigilant for his safety and freedom. In conclusion, honorable members, authoritarian regimes rely on silence. Human rights defenders rely on your international solidarity. Supporting these individuals is not symbolic, but it can be decisive in protecting lives and advancing freedom. Parliamentary advocacy, naming cases, sustained pressure can have real impact in securing releases. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Newell, and now we will go to the first round of questions and answers. And I would like to start by inviting Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for all your testimony. Hillel Noor, let me start with you, if I might. The Canadian government, as you know, had joined consensus to nominate the Iranian regime to a UN body that shapes policy on issues like women's rights, human rights, counterterrorism, and joined consensus with China and Cuba to oversee a UN committee that oversees human rights NGOs. May I ask you for your perspectives on that particular issue?
Thank you, honorable member, for this timely question. It's an issue that has sparked outrage around the world, in parliaments not only in Canada, but in the United Kingdom, in the European Parliament, and in Australia, as well as Finland and other places. On April the 8th, at a meeting of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, 2 decisions were made by Canada as well as other democracies, including France, Germany, the UK, Finland, Australia, Norway, Austria, the Netherlands. And that decision was to join consensus, number 1, on electing, as you indicated, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to nominate, rather, we want to be precise, to nominate the Islamic Republic of Iran to the UN Committee for Program and Coordination, which is meeting soon in a few weeks. 1 day on women's rights, 1 day on human rights, 1 day on peacekeeping, 1 day on terrorism prevention. The notion that the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has just massacred some 40,000 protesters in 2 days, would be nominated for election. And by the way, the election will be held in November, and it's a rubber stamp by the UNGA. The notion that the Islamic Republic of Iran would be elected to a committee that decides priorities for the United Nations on these critical issues is an insult to the memory of the tens of thousands of individuals who were killed that day. And it is an act of contempt for the people of Iran. Now, the government of Canada made I would say, a bizarre statement on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Global Affairs Canada, on their Twitter account, Canada FP. They said that this was a decision of the regional group. We had nothing to do with it. Well, yes, of course, the regional group is the one, the Asian regional group is the one that puts the names forward. But the nomination, okay, if you look at this formally, the nomination was done by ECOSOC. Canada is one of the members of ECOSOC. Canada joined the nomination. Formally, Canada is the one that joined the nomination. They joined consensus. If you want to look informally in practice, Canada could have spoken out. The chair asked, does anyone want to speak out? The United States took the floor. The United States took the floor and said, this is a shameful thing to do. And Canada chose silence. Now, is this the normal practice? No. Just a few years ago, in April 2022, when ECOSOC elected a candidate from Russia, Canada took the floor. The EU took the floor. The UK took the floor, and they said, this is wrong. How can we, keep silent when this council elects Russia? And they spoke out. Yet this time, they chose not to. So again, America spoke out in this session. Canada did not. In a previous session, when it had to do with electing another authoritarian regime, Canada spoke out. This time, they did not. So whether you look at this informally or formally, Canada joined consensus to nominate Iran, and they chose silence. This is, as a Canadian, this is something that caused me a great shame. Second, equally shameful, is the Committee on NGOs, as you indicated, Honorable Member. This is a committee which, as we are a UN-accredited NGO, we have to answer to the UN Committee on NGOs. It's 19 member states. Who are the 19 member states? Well, as of now, they include, by the election that just happened, China, okay, that oppresses 1.5 billion people, China, Cuba, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Nicaragua. These are authoritarian regimes that are now sitting on the body that regulates human rights NGOs. This is a betrayal of the human rights movement. We heard from a witness about the structures of international human rights. If our own democracies are going to abandon these structures and hand them over to the world's worst regimes that jail dissidents, that crush any NGOs, you can't have an NGO in any of these countries, then what is the purpose of the UN? Why was Canada there? Our former ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae, was president of the Economic and Social Council. How are we supposed to take these bodies seriously if Canada says, well, it doesn't matter if we nominate Iran, it doesn't matter if we join consensus in electing China, Cuba, Nicaragua, Saudi Arabia, and Sudan? I think it's absurd. So I think it was absurd what happened, and I think what doubled down was even worse was the denial. The denial, again, formally, Canada joined consensus. It's incontrovertible. And again, in practice, Canada could have taken the floor. They didn't. So I think that this shameful decision, this abandonment, and this doubling down is not befitting the principles of democracy and free society that Canada and its charter are meant to uphold.
Thank you for that powerful assessment and for your indictment of a bad decision and repeated bad judgments. But let me ask you another question in the short time I have. What concrete actions could Canada take to confront the malaise at the United Nations that you have already been doing great work in documenting, whether it is Agenda Item 7 at the UN Human Rights Council that continuously singles Israel out disproportionately to the human rights abuses of places like Iran and Beijing, whether it is the continued mandate for UNRWA, which Canada had defunded over a decade ago but has now been refunded, despite the evidence provided by you and many others on the use of schools for militant purposes around October 7th. When you look at the kind of institutional bias and problems at the United Nations itself, what kind of concrete actions would you suggest for reform?
Well, I think we could look at grand issues for reform, and these are very elusive at the UN. The UN is very difficult to achieve grand reform. I think we could look at things that are very simple that could be done, more concretely. One is to clean up who gets to sit in judgment, just as we spoke about before. The Human Rights Council includes China, Cuba, Qatar. We need to clean that up. You either need to have standards on who gets to be there, which the UN General Assembly decided that there should be standards when they created the Human Rights Council in Resolution 60/251. They said there should be standards, but they're ignored. So either we uphold the standards and we stop supporting the Islamic Republic of Iran, China, and Cuba to these bodies, or we say there's no standards and everyone gets to be on it. It's one or the other. That has to be decided, because otherwise you allow dictatorships to wear a false badge of international legitimacy to say, here's a body that has criteria and we made it on. So that's got to stop. Second, the UN system has to clean up its own credibility. We have currently a situation where external actors can fund UN special rapporteurs. We have a report coming out in the next couple of weeks, which shows that there are UN rapporteurs who are getting something like $1 million from the Chinese communist regime. I mean, one of them is a law professor in Australia named Ben Saul. He received $150,000 for his work. Now, from the Chinese communist regime, how can you be a human rights expert and receive that kind of money from one of the world's most repressive regimes? So that's got to be cleaned up. There should be no earmarked funding from anyone, certainly not from a dictatorship. We need to clean up the standards for UN reporting. Currently, UN reports get cited by international courts, yet there's very little standards for evidence, sourcing, and methodology. If these reports are getting cited by courts, they need to meet courtroom level standards. And finally, I would say we need accountability for misconduct. We need a complaints mechanism that has consequences. If there are UN officials who are acting as apologists for the world's worst regimes, there's a UN expert named Alina Duhan. She has flown into Damascus, Tehran, Caracas, to Zimbabwe to embrace the regimes. These kinds of people need to be either suspended or reprimanded or removed if they're violating the UN Code of Conduct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. I would like to invite Madam Anita Vandenberg to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And just on that previous testimony, I do want to reassure members of the committee and those watching that Canada does not support Iran for positions of influence in the United Nations. And I really appreciate we've got some incredible human rights defenders here today. And I'd just like to pick up on what some of you have said. So, Mr. Sharifi, you said something profound. You said human rights defenders are not beneficiaries, they are partners. And I'd also like to go to Ms. Hassan, who said that global networks are essential infrastructure. So my first question is that we see that with things like the World Movement for Democracy and a lot of democracy funding, primarily from south of the border, but elsewhere as well, being cut quite rapidly. A lot of these networks, the connective tissue for human rights defenders around the world, have been broken. And so human rights defenders are isolated, and this puts them in much greater danger. And I know that Equitas has some data, which if we don't have time, I'd love for you to table with the committee about the situation now. But it makes me think about, my family in World War II were in the Dutch underground resistance. And we know, many of you mentioned security. There's no way we would have won World War II with just the soldiers, just the Allies. We had to have the connections that were made with the underground resistance movements that were happening there. And the human rights defenders that are fighting autocracy, that are fighting for democracy, are really those resistance. And if we want a world where democracy is going to be that we will retain our democracy, making common cause and supporting those defenders is as important as it was in the 1940s. So I wonder if I could get comment from you on how Canada and other countries around the world, because this is an international subcommittee, how countries can help to connect human rights defenders to one another and to us so that they're not working in, I think one of you said, fragmented ways. So I'll start with Equitas, and then I'm hoping to have time for each of you, but we could always go in another round. Go ahead.
Thank you, all of you, for your attention today. So I invite you to really think about a shifting in who's actually moving forward democratic practice. So, for example, we can take a look at Brazil, which is a country that has had very different kinds of governments that have been electorally, taken to govern. And what's important to realize is the role that civic space, civil society organizations, coalition, for example, is Pacto, that convenes folks with very different political positioning, but very, very strong defense of democracy and democratic practice together, working together to make sure that that is very robust. So there's a lot of learning there that can happen just looking at that example. So connecting, again, Pacto, for example, with democracy activists in other countries. So really breaking the model of the North-South and taking a look at the shifting space that's happening globally. That's something that is in Canada's interest, and it's certainly in the interests of democracies worldwide. So for Canada to continue to thrive, we know it needs to be part of a worldwide community of democracies. I think Geraldo...
I want to get some of the other witnesses as well, because Ms. Hassan, you're part of Demoskratos, and if you could tell us a little bit about what kind of things Canada and others could do to support those kind of grassroots global networks.
Thank you so much. And I really think that we are facing this anti-rights movements in different places, but also the resources are important to bring those people together, and having champions internationally from different countries, and especially Canada, can bring, as I said, that resources is not only about funding, it's also about spaces like this now. So I really think that these networks are able to manage these transnational relationships, and at the same time giving the voices for people to speak about themselves, narrate their narratives, because mostly those spaces, people like us are not existing there. So these networks, for my opinion, in just shifting tough time in the world now, especially in regions like mine, we need these places. We need this constructive solidarity. Without this, we will continue having these fragmented things. And champions are important because they are the backbone for people like us.
Thank you. And Mr. Sharifi, you also said these networks are fragmented and underfunded. So what would you see as something that the international community could do?
Honorable Member, thank you for this question. I look at it at two ways. First, with the current ecosystem, the limited resources, I think Canada has the moral courage. It has to take that step. Canada should lead. I think this is the time. Canada should not be that conservative. With the values, the principles, the moral, I think this is the time for Canada to lead. I'm talking about this because the people that first lost everything were the human rights defenders in Afghanistan, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, the places that we work right now. And these are the good people of those countries. These are the creme of the society, Honorable Member. And you know, these people stand up to their governments because they wanted to work for Orthlars or Equitas or Government of Canada. And the moment the funding cuts came in, the first people who lost jobs were not people sitting in Montreal or DC or Ottawa. The people in Nairobi, in Kabul, in Tunis, they lost their jobs. So it's very important that we have a place, like a system, a mechanism that can sustain those support for those people. And these supports are not like millions of dollars, you know. And the second thing is compliance versus impact. we are like international organizations, international donors, and especially government of Canada is stressing on compliance. It's very important. But for a small organization, Nepal or Sri Lanka, it's very difficult to get those resources and those fundings and those applications. I think we have to find a way. The system is broken right now. I think this is the time for all of us to rethink about a dignified way of seeing, respecting all those human rights defenders in all those places. And Canada can do that.
Thank you, Madame Vandenbel. Thank you. Now, I would like, j'aimerais inviter Monsieur.
I would like to
Alexis.
invite Mr. Alexis Brunel-Duceppe to have the floor for 7 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair. I thought you had cut 2 minutes from my time. Thank you to all the witnesses for this very important study. We have a wonderful panel today. Ms. McCarthy, Mr. Ducos. Ms. McCarthy, you talked about the fact that Canada had to reclaim this leadership that it already had. I think you did say that it already had, and there's an opportunity now to maybe take more leadership in terms of defenders of human rights. But in the past year, several objective observers are looking at what's happening in the policies of the current government. Some observers are perceiving that there's a decrease of the budget for international development and the envelope that's often used to help organizations that defend rights. We see a cut of $2.5 billion, which corresponds to the trend of the Americans and in Europe and Japan that almost completely eliminated their envelope for international development. Canada is going in that direction. Mr. Carney is traveling to many countries for bilateral meetings, but he's never gone to Africa to do it. And he also let the feminist policy disappear. So we're looking at what Canada's been doing for the past year. We're very far from 0.4% asked for by the UN, and also we're not close to the OCDE standard. Ms. McCarthy, what do you think about this new trend in our government? Thank you very much for your question. And it's a good question for this committee to consider in a truly international context. A question that is being asked quite generally in the world. What needs to happen now in the future for the protection of human rights and strengthening democracy and democratic discussions? These decreases in energy that are happening throughout the world are quite visible, and Canada is currently very well positioned in order to play a role with others in this, questioning ourselves as to what needs to change in relation to the UN, in relation to the way decisions are made. And today we're coming to speak to all of you so that we can have a reflection together beyond political positioning, to see how Canada can play a role to ensure that human rights continue to be respected. I think that my colleague Gerardo could speak very concretely about this reality that we're experiencing here, and why, if we looked at the situation in 10 years, we could look at what Canada has done by supporting defenders in their communities and in their networks, and also how important this issue of gathering is. Yes, that's what we've been hearing from our partners and defenders in various communities where we work, is that budget cuts really harm local organizations in Canada, in Oceania, and many places. And the work has been adapted, the strategies changed. maybe decrease the number of people we'll be reaching in different places. These are concrete results that we learned about about 2 months ago in Kenya, where in spite of the absence of concrete resources, the defenders of human rights continue to do work that's very important in their context. So that's what we have to highlight, is that the changes that they're making are very important in the local context, be it in terms of the rights to inheritance for women, the rights to property, also for participation in civics and in community rights. And this offers a forum where, for a lesser price, we can have a very strong impact, or for a lesser cost, rather, which will rise up into broader democratic or civil areas. So there we find concrete action that has been very fruitful, and Canada should continue to support such initiatives that mobilize people. And we see that it's the front lines of democracy at the local level. So I did have the opportunity to go to Kenya, and I met organizations that are defending human rights, and what they can do with very few means is really impressive. And if they can do so much with so little, imagine what they could do with more. So that's the idea. Mr. Ba, you talked about funding as well, what you're experiencing, what you need. You're coming here to the committee, and thank you very much for sharing your experience. And also, Ms. Habia will like to hear from you. But now I would like to talk about funding. You're here, you talked about it. I would like to know to what extent it would make a difference and how many people have mobilized behind making a request to have more funding. And what's the difference? Thank you for this question. I think that in terms of the current context, my answers will be dealing with 4 points related to funding, or the role that Canada was playing in the funding of for international cooperation. Canada can create and reinforce specific programs for professional issues. So paid internships for defenders of human rights who are living in exile. So I had the opportunity to work with Equitas as a communications assistant. So this was a program from which I benefited in 2023. It's a concrete example. We can also award scholarships to the defenders of human rights. Also, supporting organizations specialized in defending human rights, such as Equitas, Amnesty International, and others, to provide workshops for human rights defenders living in exile. The other thing I would suggest is to accelerate the recognition of foreign credentials. So I had my master's in political science and legal issues, and I still haven't received an answer. Creating a bridge between human rights and policies, and then integrate or share the fruit of our experiences in human rights abroad, but share that in Canada. We're not starting in at zero. We're adapting our experience to the Canadian context. Thank you. We went over 1 minute, but I'll leave you time to speak later. I'd like to ask Mr. Zobedi to speak for 5 minutes. Thank you.
I'll start with Equitas. I know that you do education and supporting civil society. Can you speak a bit more about how you build capacity through education in terms of your work?
Absolutely. In fact, there's thousands and thousands of individuals that have gone through from over 150 countries in the world over the past 4 decades programming, and that participation in several weeks of training with others, learning from others, has not just a ripple effect, but just a profound effect when they go back home to their communities. I could speak with some very specific examples, and Gerardo can speak actually a little bit more about the actual concrete data and the number of people that are touched directly. But essentially, we have defenders who've talked about the knowledge that they gain from others that then goes back, multiplies not just to the dozens, but the hundreds of young people who then understand more their rights, are able to claim it, have been able to then secure decisions that have been made in their favor in their respective communities. We have as well, for example, other defenders who've talked about how they've been able to transform not only work practices in their own organizations, but in coalitions of organizations, so that they're much more inclusive. They're thinking about human rights from different perspectives. So, for example, disabled people who are struggling for their rights, but understanding it with the lens of perhaps a gender lens, depending on where the person sits economically, and how that actually has then widened the impact and their ability to mobilize people around these questions, but most importantly, decision makers. And thirdly, the huge impact and the ability of defenders going through the type of programming that's very participatory and very anchored in their knowledge and the knowledge of others and the instruments themselves, but their capacity to discuss with decision makers in their own countries, no matter the context. So in some of the most hostile contexts, some of the most difficult contexts, we did a research of human rights defenders and educators in conflict areas, and that, and we can share the results of that, but it's confirmed the importance and effect that in the midst of conflict, how actually, yes, when people are looking for food and security, actually are also looking to secure their rights, can be very effective in terms of securing safety and around them.
And so how have the funding impacts, the reduction or the uncertainty around the funding situation in your environment impacted civil society organizations globally? How would you characterize that? Maybe Monsieur Ducot or Ms. McCarthy.
So the cutting in financing or reducing in finance for supporting human rights education programs obviously has an impact on the spread or how many people can actually participate in our trainings. For example, in Canada, we normally receive around 100 participants each year. This last year we did the 43rd session of the International Human Rights Training Program. Given the restrictions in funding, we had to reduce a little bit the number of participants. That has a counter ripple effect when they get back to their communities. In other contexts, for example, in East Africa and West Africa, the reducing of funding will actually stifle the capacity to give some bursaries to the defenders to implement local actions in their communities. For example, organizing a community forum or a community mobilization initiative that actually mobilizes community members to engage in meaningful ways, not just with the defenders themselves, but also with duty bearers, and bring to the forefront the issues that are more relevant to them, that are affecting them. And that specifically for women and other marginalized groups in different communities, though, that creates really a vacuum when we don't when they don't have the necessary resources to being able to implement these kind of initiatives. And these initiatives don't cost much. I mean, with a very limited funding of $1,500, it's amazing what a small community can do in terms of engaging. But cutting that $1,500 has an impact. So there is a void that is created there.
What I may just add, just very quickly, organizations that we're talking about today, and that many who are being represented as well, being cut did not stop their capacity of working. It limited, but their determination continued. That's what we saw all throughout the year when there were huge cuts that were happening, given contractions that were happening, of course, the U.S., but also, from other donor countries. Huge impacts on their ability, but not stopping the work. And so I guess the question is really, why cannot Canada then reverse the trend or create a new trend and actually make sure that the proper support is lended in this critical moment, instead of following a trend that unfortunately is having dire impacts then on the democratic fabric of those communities.
Thank you, Mr. Zubaili. And now I invite Madame Crons to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all the witnesses who have shared their experience today. Ms. Hassan, you focused your efforts on women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa. I'm wondering if you could share with us what the state of those rights are in those part of the world. What are the biggest barriers that women are still facing, and are there likely to be any sort of easy wins or advances that are happening now that will benefit us?
Thank you so much for the question. I think the situation for women in the Middle East is one of the complicated issues and multi-layered. But if we can see in the countries which has some stability, and definition of stability is also so complicated in this region, we can see how some of the laws and regulations have been advanced, but without mechanisms to implement. So we can see now that we have a progressive law for combating violence against women in Tunisia, as example, but it is written, but it's not implemented on the ground based on different things and others, and the attacks for women human rights defenders in country like Tunisia, and the one who created this law in Tunisia while she was a parliamentarian. We have the system of the countries which mainly have wars and conflicts, and we can see how sexual violence, rape, and gang rape have been not only increased, but it have been also a weapon of war, like what's happening in Sudan. What's happening in Sudan is one of the most outrageous things happening to women without, of course, local mechanisms, and the international system is failing, I think, the Sudanese women big time. We can also see the other countries which have some of the opening, like the Gulf countries, they did some of the opening in certain things, but the holistic approach is still not implemented. We can see that the economic participation for women is one of the main barriers for women. Legal system, especially in the private life, and combating violence against women. But we can see some of the advancement in the public sphere. So some countries like Egypt now has more female judges, but at the same time, we still have not having some laws and regulations which protect women. So how to bring women's issues to the status of not being on tokenism more than full empowerment. This is a hard thing. But for the conflict, I think sexual violence, rape, and gang rape is the most outrageous things have been facing women from this region.
Well, I'm wondering how the 2011 revolution in Egypt galvanized you and inspired you to think about what would be possible in terms of change.
Yeah, what has been happening in Egypt, and I'm so proud that I was part of this process for years. I think in Egypt, especially, women's movements and feminist movements have been capitalized on these changes in different things. We have been facing outrageous attacks personally and on the level of the women human rights defenders, also the spread of the gang rape and sexual violence, in addition to other restrictions. But at the same time, we have been working deeply on changing the constitution, having new laws to combat and criminalize sexual harassment, having women judges in Egypt, have more women in the police and other things. And because of that, I think that having this intersectional and transnational movements and groups are giving the spaces for each others to share experiences and also to see how some generations have been trying to open some spaces so others can build on it on intergenerational and also open-minded processes.
Thank you, Ms. Cronus. Now, j'invite M. Brunet-Duceppe de prendre la parole pour 5 minutes.
I would like to invite Mr. Brunet-Duceppe to have the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Habibia, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. I had the opportunity to take part in a multi-partisan committee where we realized we were able to take out a former Afghan MP and her family. It was a lengthy labor. We worked in secret for a year, and we managed to bring out women who were involved in the public sphere in Afghanistan. So it wouldn't have taken. It would have been a problem for these women with the Taliban takeover. So I'd like to know how difficult it is to be a defender of human rights, a woman defender of human rights. But I think maybe you could explain that to the committee.
For the question. Being a women rights defender in Afghanistan is extremely dangerous. You face, women protesters face blazing guns in their faces, but they still stand and fight for their rights and the rights of younger generation who are younger girls in Afghanistan. But we have to be honest that I agree with Odette that funding has caused a reduction in the scope of many organizations. But to be very honest, when the cuts come and the support gets reduced, it's those people on the ground that actually suffer, as Omid mentioned. Right now, civil society and human rights defenders in Afghanistan have not the right support. They are dying, and the civil society is literally dying in Afghanistan. And it's important that we support them, and there are different mechanisms and ways. I think there is so much talk about cuts of development aid by America, by US, but I think it's time that we should start thinking about a world without American aid. If Canada takes leadership and talks about middle powers in defense and economics or trade, why not for protecting civil spaces and civic spaces? It has actually done so. I mentioned in my remarks that Canada was one, along with Germany, Netherlands, and Australia, actually, were the 4 countries that started the persecution of Taliban under violation of CEDAW and the Convention of at UN Forum, at the Court of International Law. It's important that such coalitions are built for protection of civic spaces, so that the real defenders are protected, supported for their rights. There are different dangers and isolations that women human rights defenders face. There's social challenges. There's the fear of stigma. They are being called as foreign agents. morally deviant. They are threatened, harassed, not only them, but their families as well. And also, economically, they have lost all means of earning or income. At the end of the day, you have to make a choice to support your family, to provide income. So if you don't support them, they would suffer greatly.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il me reste du temps? Parce que peut-être que Mme Hassan...
Sorry. Do we have more time? Maybe Ms. Hassan would like to add something on this particular issue. Is there a difference for women who are human rights defenders in relation to men, human rights defenders?
Yeah, there are multiple differences, I think, on different levels. One, how women have been treated from the society to the state's repressions. It's really different than other men. Personally, I was prosecuted in Egypt as part of the foreign funding case, and I got one of the charges against me. None of others, men or other women, got that. I'm supporting women to have irresponsible liberty. So there is something about the morals are affecting women human rights defenders more than men. Also, there is this effect of the personal life is different than the men, because within the system, people can respect more men taking outrageous processes more than women.
Pouvez-vous nous donner un exemple? Vous avez dit que vous avez une sentence différente que celle des hommes.
An example, you said that their experience is different from others. Could you give a concrete example in terms of the expectations, moral expectations?
1 minute.
Okay, not only by the expectations, but also by the pressure. Women human rights defenders are pressured by their families and their communities more than men. And when they are working, especially if they are working on gender issues or women's issues, on state repression, it has more multi-layers than others. Women human rights defenders mostly have been attacked by violence, sexual violence, threats of rape, and other things.
Merci, Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Mr. Brunet-Duceppe.
Mr. Ba and Ms. Habir, both of you have worked with vulnerable groups. How do overlapping identities such as gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation intensify the risks of human rights defenders, and how should Canadian policy respond?
En fait, en lien avec notre contexte,
in relation to our context, I think the fact that there were cuts in international cooperation limit the actions of organizations protecting the rights of the LGBT community. In Mali, here's a concrete example. When they speak out, they do it under cover of the humanitarian organizations. So it's an organization that is intervening in AIDS under organizations who come to defend that. So it's done in a kind of undercover way. And in the field, there are very limited activities. Organizations that protect the rights of LGBT people have limited activities. They have to have people of allies with the institutions that protect human rights and everything. It's not everyone that's open. The problems of the rights of this community is not a legal problem. It's an attitude problem. It's a sub-Saharan world that's not ready to accept these activities or the way of seeing things that the LGBT people have. So it's not everyone who supports them. I worked on 3 major projects, EGIPREC, Tiensira, and CIREL. So EGIPREC, we have mobile legal clinics that went to see members of the communities. We can't invite them to major hotels. The state actors can perceive that as being us promoting their activities. We had to really move around in a very not very visible way. So that's what I can say about the role of the defenders of human rights defenders and how they have to intervene in those countries. It's not a favorable context.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I think with each layer, there is an extra added pressure and repression that you face. But I'll go with example of Afghanistan because that's what I know more about. If in Afghanistan, if you are a man, but from a different ethnicity, and you are protesting or there is an accusation, you face different treatment. But if you're a woman, that changes the whole dynamic. You are repressed beyond words. There was a question about how different women are treated. And Madam Hassan replied that, and we are from similar regions, there is definitely social and family pressures. But even treatments by the hand of the governments is very, very different. We have had several cases of having women transferred to male jails, men's jails, and being held there. They have been sexually violated while in prison. So all these things are basically added layers to the oppression they face. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Ba, one final question for you. Based on your experience in Canada, what is working well in Canada, and what barriers are still in place for defenders trying to continue their advocacy here in Canada? Yeah, Mr. Ba, yeah.
Okay. Ils peuvent répéter la question, s'il vous plaît?
Could you please repeat the question?
What is working well here in Canada, and what are there still any barriers in place here in Canada for defenders trying to continue their advocacy here in Canada?
En fait, l'un des avantages ici, c'est que
One of the advantages here is that they're not acting in an isolated way. All the organizations here in Canada work a little bit as a consortium. These different, they don't always work on the same issues, but they work together. Each organization has its own expertise and contributes their knowledge in terms of defensive rights. Equitas deals with education. Amnesty International comes with petitions. And other organizations all function differently. So there's a harmonization. There's a kind of framework, a group of organizations that allow the harmonizations of approaches. The obstacles here for the defenders who live in exile is the lack of recognition for their professional experience in the field. They worked in the context of countries that are in situations of conflict. And the other problem is in an academic way. We can have master's degrees or PhDs, but the administrative process for recognitions of these credentials is very slow. The results are not there. Another barrier, because these people have just come into a new context, the fact that they have to create a new professional group or community, a group of friends, everything starts all over. For example, when I came, I started by doing volunteer work in community organizations. After that, I went to work for human rights organizations, working on welcoming immigrants who are working for defending human rights or claiming asylum. So
Mr. Davis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Noor, my question is going to be for you, but I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. We're hearing a dangerous idea take hold that Canada should accept the world as it is rather than strive for what we want it to be. My fear is that when we accept the world as it is, we accept the imprisonment of dissidents in China, the aggression of Russia, the brutality of Iran. We accept that abusers can sit on bodies like the UN Human Rights Council and shape the very rules they violate. Canada has never been at its best when it lowers its expectations to match the worst actors on the global stage. When we've been strongest, we have been strongest when we challenge injustice, not accommodate it. If we trade principle for convenience, we don't stabilize the world, we legitimize its worst behaviors. Canada must not manage decline, it must lead with conviction. So the world to me means we engage in trade negotiations, international relationships, and protecting the interests of Canadians. We can't turn a blind eye for economic expediency. So in this new world order, do you believe Canada could better ensure that its trade, investment, or diplomatic relationships do not directly or indirectly enable forced labor, particularly in regions where human rights violations are happening today? So in your view, is this where the line between pragmatic diplomacy and moral concession? And how should human rights proponents understand the world as it is?
Thank you, Honourable Member, for that question. I believe that Canada has a long history of being a leader when it comes to principles of human rights and democracy and decency, and it should not forsake those principles for expediency or for trade or for pragmatism. We heard earlier in this session from an honourable member whose family were involved in the Dutch resistance. Canada, it's to Canada's credit that Canada's Canadian servicemen are honoured every year, thousands of them. Candles are lit every Christmas Eve to honor the Canadians who defeated Hitler. So Canada has a great legacy when it comes to defeating evil and standing for human rights. And indeed, as was mentioned in this session, the name of John Humphrey is a Canadian law professor that I knew at McGill University who helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So when our leaders go to meet the leaders of China and Qatar and send them a signal that Canada is going to kowtow to the powers that be, that's wrong. I think we heard from an honourable member that Canada does not support Iran in leadership positions, but actually Canada did join consensus on April 8th to nominate Iran. So Canada did join consensus to elect China to the United Nations Committee on NGOs. That is the committee that oversees the work of human rights groups. Thousands of accredited human rights groups around the world have to answer to the UN Committee on NGOs. There's only 19 members of that. And Canada joined consensus to elect China and Cuba and Nicaragua and Sudan, which, as we heard before, is a place that's having mass rape is taking place. So I think it's not enough for Canada to go along to get along at UN bodies. It's not enough for Canada to go to Beijing and shake hands with dictatorships and say that we have to be pragmatic. Canada cannot abandon its leadership role. And I think there are concrete steps that Canada could take to help human rights defenders. You need to give them a platform. Don't give a platform to Beijing. Give a platform to those who are defying Beijing. Amplify their voices in Parliament and internationally. We need to impose real costs on the oppressors. We need to use Magnitsky sanctions, visa bans, legal tools to target officials who are responsible for repression, including Chinese intimidation of Canadians, which is happening, which is widespread, and Iranian IRGC, hundreds of them allegedly in the streets of Canada. And we need to be consistent. Human rights can't be selective. We can't turn a blind eye. If there are Uyghurs who are subjected, a million Uyghurs who are put into camps and having their beards cut off to erase their religion and their culture. If we're not consistent on human rights, then we lose our credibility. And credibility is protection for dissidents. Thank you, Honourable Member.
Thank you for that. So I would like to pivot at this point. I want to ask you about.
I'm sorry. Our next time is off.
That went fast.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ben, on va continuer. Je vais faire du pouce
Thank you,
là-dessus.
Chair. I will continue in that vein. You know, that committee where you're testifying was sanctioned by China, Mr. Newer. So in 2020, we carried out a study to show that there was a massacre of people in Xinjiang. So we have been sanctioned personally as MPs by China because there is a relationship that's getting warmer between China and Canada. 3 days before his Davos speech, Mr. Carney was photographed with Mr. Xi Jinping. So you talked about consistency, and currently there are violations by international human rights in China that are well known, that are documented, that have been proven. And however, we can seem to keep to be silent, whereas we denounce other ones carried out by Russia or in Ukraine by Russia. So how do we have these two very different ways of dealing with the same issue? We're saying, well, the relationships with the U.S. are really difficult, and now we turn to those regimes. Is that acceptable to your mind? Thank you for the question. I agree. So it's unacceptable to have different ways of dealing with countries on the same issue. And I'm talking about China. It's a regime that affects
5e d'humanité. Donc, si on est silencieux
it's one-fifth of humanity, so 1.5 billion people. If we're silent for Chinese, we are silent regarding 1/5 of humanity, of the world population. So it's something that's not to be taken lightly. It's very important because the influence of China is over dissidents that are elsewhere in the world, everywhere, including Canada. We can see that transnational repression that's very intense.
On April 8th, Canada is a member of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. It's not an insignificant body because our ambassador, Bob Ray, who was the ambassador in New York, was the president of this council just about a year or two ago. So it's a body that we say is important. We as Canadians, we say, go to the United Nations, listen to the United Nations. We criticize other countries if they take actions that are not consistent with what the United Nations says. And then we go and we elect the Chinese communist regime to a UN body that oversees human rights. We elect the Cuban police state, which represses playwrights, that has hundreds of political prisoners. We put in Nicaragua as a dictatorship that expelled 200 political prisoners and dissidents, that had to put them in prison and expelled them. Sudan, where there's killings of tens of thousands of people, millions are starving. We elect these regimes. Canada joined consensus to put them on the UN Committee on NGOs, didn't take the floor. Sometimes say, well, we had to because that's how it is with this. We know you could take the floor, and we know Canada's done it before. So I think we need explanations. We need Canada to speak out. Let's remember Wang Binzhang, the father of the Chinese democracy movement. And I know your committee has heard about him before, but I have to mention him because his daughter, Tiana Wang, came to speak for us many times at our Geneva summit, at the United Nations Human Rights Council. China sent spies who pretended to be NGO activists to spy and intimidate her when she testified at the United Nations a number of years ago. Her father, Wang Binzhang, is the heroic founder of the Chinese democracy movement. He's someone who came to do his PhD at McGill University in Montreal. He saw what democracy was, he saw what freedom was, and he created a Chinese democracy movement. When he was abroad in Vietnam, I believe it was 2002, he was kidnapped. Him and others, they went to meet Chinese labor activists. They kidnapped him, threw him in prison. He's been languishing in confinement for 2 decades. And his daughter went to my law school, to McGill Law School, and came to testify. Canada needs to call for his immediate release and not to be, complicit in rewarding the oppressor. We need to stand with the persecuted much more than we're doing now.
Merci. Et comment c'est perçu?
And how is it perceived internationally? Because I had the opportunity of carrying out several missions with the Speaker of the House in Iceland and Norway, but I have contacts with many other people internationally because of my work. And we were spoken a lot with the Davos speech. I was 100% in agreement, but I have the impression that what Mr. Carney said in Davos does not match the actions undertaken by our government. So I congratulated him for his speech. But how is it that in terms of action, it does not translate into appropriate action, Mr. Newer? Thank you for the question.
Speeches are important, but look, if we call out, the President of the United States, but meanwhile, the United States is the only country that took the floor on April 8th at the Economic and Social Council to say electing China and Cuba is wrong. And the only country that said that nominating the Islamic Republic of Iran is wrong. Canada was silent. Canada could have spoken. Canada spoke there in April 2022 when it came to the issue of Russia, and Ukraine. They chose this time silence. This is not Canada's tradition. This is not living up to the Canadian Charter. This is not living up to the vision that Mr. Carney expressed in Switzerland, where I live. We need to see actions matching words.
Thank you, Mr. Nguyen. Now I invite Madame Vandenbeld to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sharifi, you mentioned in your remarks that what is needed is flexible funding, and others have said similar things. And what I note in a lot of the testimony that we've heard is that the project-based funding model, treating democracy and human rights as if it's like other ODA projects, like health or education, actually doesn't quite fit, because having to decide 5 years in advance what activities, what outputs, a year or two sometimes to get the contract for the funding, and it's very time constrained. 5-year project and then you move on. This isn't how democracy, what the needs are right now. It's more about long-term flexible funding, risk-taking, which of course, also governments are not likely to do, and rapid. That sometimes things change on a dime, and we need to get the support in tomorrow. I wonder if you could talk about, because we have things like the Equality Fund, where we're funding small grassroots women's organizations, that if there's a different model that would actually better suit. We're not talking about a lot of money, as you said, but is there something we could do that would be a better fit, that would better support the organic human rights defenders who are doing this work with almost nothing, to be able to interconnect and be supported? I'll actually start with Mr. Sharifi, and then I'd like to hear from Ms. McCarthy and the others if I have time. Mr. Sharifi?
Honorable Member, thank you for this question. Look, I have been in this ecosystem for the last 20 years, and we're not talking about 5 years project. That is a luxury. I have been dealing with 6 months projects to a year, and the maximum project we have got is a 1-year project or 2 years project. So that is the level of commitment from international community and countries to organizations like our activist movements, human rights education organizations, and the local organizations who are doing the real work. They are on the streets doing this important work for all of us. If it's human rights education, if it is painting walls, if it's about advocacy, raising awareness, they are on those streets doing this important work. And the projects they get is very, very short term. I think this whole system of development and aid is broken, and I think this is the time. Mr. Zubairi mentioned a question. I just want to point out some figures that I just recently wrote an article about. So the international aid, which has gone from USAID $63 billion or something in 2023, 2024, is just that tip of the iceberg. But this, like the countries like Germany, the generous Swedish, the Netherlands, all of them have half their support for all these humanitarian international programs. So USAID was just the big news that we all saw, but other countries have already been doing this. UK has been already doing this. So that notion of that the global north leading a lot of humanitarian aid and development, I think was gone with USAID dismantling under President Trump. So I think at this moment of time, we have this opportunity to rebuild the system. And also having these big international organizations with multi-million dollars as intermediaries, I think that is not working for this time because they're not rapid. They cannot shape-shift at the moments that you need them. So I think it's a time for all of us in this ecosystem to sit down, rethink all of this, and find a solution which is both indigenous to the places that we're working and the need, like the defenders, the real people who need this at this moment.
Ms. McCarthy, if you could add, because I know that sometimes it's a matter of trying to take existing projects and make them fit the actual realities of what the defenders need, as opposed to the other way around. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. I'm just going to be clear. I said earlier that when funding has been cut or when funding has been constrained, what we have seen and what we've is a continuing of work, but that's on the backs of people, and that's because of determination and will. It's not because of funds, and it's to show resilience and the importance that people actually are taking to defend the rights and the rights of others in their communities in the democratic space. And they're very isolated, doing momentous work with nothing or next to nothing. So I think that's really important. Canada's absolutely could be creative and innovative by building on this idea of supporting, call it networking, call it coalition building, call it collective work, call it whatever we want to name that, but a space where there can be an exchange of knowledge, there can be trust, it can be safe, good practice can be exchanged, and there can be an agility that happens. And that there are funds to support either the action that needs to happen in the countries or the action that can be taken collectively.
Thank you. If you could wrap it, please, because time is out. Yes.
And the last thing I would just say is to ensure, and Omaid said it very clearly, and it's, many of the speakers today have pointed out to the importance of disassociating with sort of that project-focused and really supporting that essentially is sort of the core of the work that needs to be done. And the results that can come back can be reported on in a very diligent manner when that flexibility is accorded. So a mechanism that would really allow for that coalition, that collective work, but supporting as well the individual and needed work in this particular context that it's happening would be a way for Canada to show leadership in a very creative and innovative way in this current 2026 context.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is to Hillel Noor. The government has said that UNRWA supports values of human rights and peace. Meanwhile, the United States, Sweden, Netherlands have all cut or ended their funding to UNRWA for complicity with terrorism. Germany and 5 others have voted to abstain on renewing the UNRWA mandate. Now, UN Watch has been documenting problems with this organization for well over a decade with numerous reports. Do you agree with that direction that countries are taking when it comes to this institution? And what have you found in recent times?
I would like to thank the honorable member for that question about an agency that employs 30,000 people. The UNHCR employs something like 16,000 workers, and UNRWA employs nearly double that, 30,000. So it's a billion-dollar agency that is extremely influential, and so is one of the UN's largest humanitarian agencies. And unfortunately, the question of whether it's living up to its humanitarian mission is very germane. It would be one thing if a number of years ago, if Canadian leaders would say, we don't know exactly what's happening with UNRWA, but no one can claim today that they don't know. Our organization came to Ottawa, I think it was in 2017. So we're talking about nearly a decade ago with a 200-page report on what Canada is funding. So for a decade, we were sounding the alarm that there are hundreds of UNRWA teachers based in Gaza, Jordan, Lebanon, and other places who are funded by Canada and who are actively promoting terrorism, who celebrate the killing of Jews, who glorify Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler, who celebrate Hamas attacks. And honorable members, it's actually much worse than that. We revealed in the past year or two that the heads of UNRWA's education system, again, the reason that the Canadian government justifies giving money to UNRWA is we need to educate Palestinians. As UNRWA says, they're educating them for human rights, UN values of peace and human rights. The opposite is true. We know that the heads of education at UNRWA are not just supporters of Hamas, but literally Hamas terror chiefs. I'll mention just two as case studies. In Gaza, the head of the UNRWA Teachers Union, 8,000 teachers in Gaza, the head of it was a man named Suhail al-Hindi. Suhail al-Hindi is also a member of the Hamas Politburo. I'll say that again, a member of the Hamas Politburo, seen in pictures with Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of October 7th, was heading the UNRWA Teachers Union. He was head of a school. He was a principal. He was teaching students. So the heads of the education system are leaders of Hamas. This was known. Everybody knew it. UNRWA initially denied it. Eventually, they had to accept it. And he's now one of the Hamas leaders in exile. He meets with the Iranian regime representing Hamas, and he was the leader of UNRWA. Second, in Lebanon, same situation, same modus operandi. The name was Fathi Sharif, teacher for 30 years outside of Tyre, Lebanon, at a school of UNRWA, head of a school, principal, and head of 2,000 teachers, head of the teachers union. He was the head of Hamas in Lebanon. I'll say that again. The head of the UNRWA teachers union, teacher and school principal, was the head of Hamas in Lebanon. Now, don't take my word for it. Hamas said it. When justice was delivered to him, I believe it was September 2024, a missile came to his second floor apartment and delivered justice to him. Hamas put out a video saying our leader was killed. Fathi Sharif, the UNRWA teacher and school principal, head of the teachers union, gave great jihadi education. So no one can say we don't know. This is the heads of the system. So it's not a few bad apples. It's rotten to the core. An agency that should be helping Palestinians is instead poisoning them with leaders of Hamas terrorism heading their education system. So I think Canada cannot pretend that it doesn't know. It knows. Our website, unwatch.org, has a whole UNRWA terror network of 400 plus UNRWA teachers and other employees, how they are connected to Hamas, either supporting it or terror chiefs or praising terrorism. And if we actually want to help Palestinians, we shouldn't be poisoning the minds of another generation by funding terrorism.
Thank you for that. Now, in your testimony, you've described how institutionally through places like the Human Rights Council or operationally through organizations like UNRWA, among others, the UN is clearly failing its mandate to support democracy and particularly people who are striving for democracy, those reformers. In a very short answer, because I'm not giving you much time to really respond, but I'm curious for your views. If you were the Secretary General of the United Nations and you could do one thing to try and fix this institutional and operational set of problems, what would you do?
Excuse me, Mr. Majumdar, I will give 2 minutes each after because time is over. I have to be fair with everyone. He will answer you. We'll give another 2 minutes for each one.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the honorable member. Look, if I were Secretary General, I think the main thing that needs to happen at the United Nations...
Excuse me. You will answer later on because we have to respect the time. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe I'd like to come back to you, Ms. McCarthy. I think you said that Canada has already been a leader in the past. We know Mr. Lester B. Pearson, Mr. Mulroney, which helped take apart apartheid by convincing Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan of the wisdom of doing this. And there was Jean Chrétien, who became very close to the African countries. And I went on missions in Cameroon, Rwanda, and elsewhere in Africa, is that Canada is abandoning the place that it had was occupying. And the people that I met in NGOs feel that Canada's no longer interested and leaving a space to other entities. And we're not only they're not only losing funding, but it's felt on the field that what Canada used to do well, they're no longer doing. Can you answer to that question? Explain to us whether there are any solutions to this problem. Canada can do more and can do better. So, yes, increase contributions for international cooperation in the legislation on cooperation. Human rights are integrated. So there's a possibility of being very active in that sphere to really respect what's said in speeches and transform that into action. It's clear that Canada can play that role. Secondly, to be much more explicit and have a better articulated international policy. We know that there's a paper that will be published very soon. We read that in the paper, and we are also hearing that that is being discussed. It's the moment, more than ever, to have Canada articulate very clearly how human rights will shape its international policy in 2026. And again, I'm saying that if we went 10 years forward in the future and we're looking back at a moment when Canada could have distinguished itself and maybe influenced others, be it in the South, I'm talking about Brazil and South Africa, countries that have democratic practices that might be useful in this. So to look at its way into entering into relationships, looking at that, yes, for economic reasons, but human rights and international cooperation go hand in hand. And it's really time for Canada to do this. And our current context means this is it's an opportunity to do it, and Canada needs to think about where it will position itself. It will take courage. It will take supported commitment, and we're hearing from human rights defenders and organizations defending human rights. This can be revealed in concrete action. So this could really help further human rights on the international scene. And Canada currently has an opportunity to do this. I'm highly encouraged by the commitment we're hearing today from the members of this committee, which is a representation of various political parties. So it can really show how we can work for defending human rights and democratic spaces. Maybe Mr. Ba or another witness would like to speak about this, about the fact that Canada held a leadership role and no longer does it so much. And as Ms. McCarthy said, Canada is not a big military power or economic power, but I'm a Quebec sovereigntist telling you this. Canada held this kind of leadership for a long time, and it was known to be a champion of human rights. And should that not be a government seized by the current government? So maybe we can ask you to answer in the next turn, Ms. Habib-Pierre. So I would like Mr. Zuberi to speak for 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
Habib Bar, around you made an interesting comment around the importance of middle powers, essentially, and humanitarian support for humanitarian work to be done without America in mind. Do you want to speak a bit more around that? How, in your suggestion, that be done?
I think it will probably and hopefully answer the question the gentleman here had as well. Canada has had strong leadership in the past, and we hope to see that leadership, if considered lost, coming back. As I mentioned before, while we are trying to use or utilize the middle powers for economic purposes, for security purposes, why not? For saving the civic spaces as well, for development aid as well. Thinking and foregoing the fact that we have been, or the world has been, dependent so much on the U.S. as a leader in the development aid. But we are living in a world without U.S. development aid. So we should continue building those partnerships and going forward. It's not only about the middle powers, but the coalitions that can be built. Excuse me. One impact of cut down by international aid from U.S., unfortunately, was the impact it had on other partners. A lot of other countries just copied the move and started cutting down their aid as well. So having coalitions, talking to them, reaching out to them, trying to explain and become a voice for the civic spaces, become the voice for the voiceless, so to say, I think will bring Canada's leadership or reclaim Canada's leadership position in global states.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zubaili. Mr. Majumdar, you have the floor for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'll take this time to pose the question to Hillel Neuer as I had in the previous round.
Thank you. Look, if I were UN Secretary General, the main priority would be to restore moral clarity and credibility. If the United Nations cannot tell the difference between victims and their oppressors, it loses the very reason that it exists. So we need to restore moral clarity and credibility. The UN's greatest asset is legitimacy, and it's eroding. So we need to end the culture of false equivalence. To say that the world's largest dictatorship is the same as a liberal democracy is wrong. And when mass atrocities occur, the United Nations has to stop being silent. The Secretary General Guterres, I don't think I've ever heard him condemn what China is doing to the Uyghurs. I don't think I've ever heard him condemn what China is doing to the Tibetans. I don't think I've ever heard him call out the Cuban police state for putting artists in prison, for putting youngsters in prison. So too many countries get a free pass because they might be powerful or have powerful alliances. So when mass atrocities occur, the UN and its leadership have to name perpetrators clearly and consistently, whether they're powerful or not. Second, you have to stop empowering abusers inside the system. So if the UN allows China, Cuba, and Qatar to be sitting on the UN Human Rights Council, it's wrong. Authoritarian regimes cannot be chairing human rights bodies or shaping global norms if we take it seriously. If we want to say the UN is a joke, then fine. But those of us who say, especially those who say go to the UN, then you have to take it seriously. So we need to mobilize a coalition of democracies to block and expose these appointments, make institutional hypocrisy politically costly. And I would say that, we have to help victims, refocus the UN on victims, not politics. Too often, the system amplifies the regimes and it sidelines dissidents. I would systematically prioritize giving the floor to dissidents, the kind that we bring to our Geneva summit, political prisoners, human rights defenders, victims of repression, whether they're from the Islamic Republic of Iran, whether they're from China, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Pakistan, Cuba. Give them the floor, not the regimes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Majumdar.
Oui. Merci infiniment, Monsieur le Président. Je me rends compte que j'ai pas posé.
Chair. I realize that I did not ask Mr. Sharifi a single question. I apologize for that. So maybe for my final turn, I would let you have the final word. What do human rights defenders currently need the most? What is a priority? So I would like you to say if there's anything you haven't said that you'd like to say, please go ahead.
Defenders need at this moment is hope. By hope, I mean somebody in the global north standing up to the values that we all are speaking about. I think that space is empty. We have long been talking about human dignity, freedom, democracy, on all those values that people have lost their lives for. So it's time that we give them that hope that Canada is standing up and Canada is taking the lead. The rest will come. Resources, money, funding, coalition, all of that is next steps. At this moment, they need hope.
Merci infiniment pour ça. Peut-être que
Thank you so much for this. Maybe that is my final word. Thank you, Mr. Nair. Or does one of you wish to answer? Thank you for the question. My contribution is related to the implementation of Canada's leadership at the international level, especially my experience I've had with Lawyers Without Borders. They had something about the generation succession, so they recruit young jurists coming out of university and to prepare them for the bar exams or other exam. Because in Mali, for 500,000 inhabitants, we have just about a dozen magistrates. So they're trying to recruit more magistrates and more lawyers to facilitate access to justice. So if Canada no longer funds this international assistance project, they lose their perception as leaders. And same thing with Equitas in education. Without education, people can't know what their rights are. So if we're cutting budgets of implementation of these projects, Canada's leadership is going to lose ground. For example, World Health work with community organizations. They can fund them, they can build their capacity, and they have projects for dealing with medical waste. If Canada doesn't fund those organizations, the country will lose its leadership. So we can just really advocate that Canada respect its commitments for international assistance. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to all our witnesses for your evidence on this meeting about the current situation for democracy and human rights defenders around the world.
The chair and the members would like to thank you all. Thank you for your presence, your introduction, your answering our question, illustrate this subcommittee. If you feel that you still need to share some idea, suggestion, opinion, feel free to address either to the chair or to the clerk. Thank you very much. Une dernière note avant de partir.
My final note before leaving. For the study on displaced people within their countries and outside their countries on a global scale, please send us all the name of the additional witnesses to the clerk of the subcommittee before 12 noon, Friday, May 8th, 2026.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.